Hello, everyone. It's me again with the Idiot's Guide series. And we're going to go to a guide to the not very well known, it's guide to the modern printed Byzantine type or majority text Greek New Testaments. All right, so let's go through it. All right, so basically, early representative of the Byzantine type manuscripts, which represents a majority of Greek manuscripts. And the Byzantine type texts or majority texts represent over 90% surviving Greek New Testament manuscripts, predominantly dating from the 9th century or later, and it's the standard text of the Byzantine Empire and the Orthodox Church. So, just to add to that, is that in modern textual criticism, the major translations, English translation of this type is the King James and the New King James Version. So, what you find here is that a lot of the your Greek Bibles do not represent the Byzantine type text. And the reality is, it's the only family type text. If we go by E.C. Cowell, that is where you have a 90% agreement, I think it's 90 or 70% agreement, but the Byzantine text is about 90%, is that it's the only clear text type out of all the so-called text types. Yeah. So the notable witnesses, Greg of Nicaea, John Chrysostom is probably the one that's probably well known, Basil the Great, Cyril of Jerusalem. Um, so dating from the 4th century, hence earlier than the Petista, is the Ethiopic version of the Gospel, best represented by the surviving 5th and 6th century manuscripts of the Garima Gospels and classified by Rokos Zurond as early Byzantine. So the earliest one is Codex Alexandrinus, which is representing the Gospels. There is Alexandrian in the Pauline epistles. So that's the manuscript. So basically, one of the advantages of the Byzantine text type is that it was used by the church throughout history. All right. So consistently, it was used throughout the church. Some argue from the 4th century, some argue from the 9th century, but it was used by the church. I mean, when I mean the church, I'm talking about the worldwide church as it was at the time, Turkey, Greece, etc. So let's go on. So the advantage of this text type, right, in terms of the quantity, all right, it's the accuracy, and they're very accurate. The scribes are very meticulous and very few scribal errors. And if you, where do I get the information from? What you do, you look at Alan Taylor Farn's doctoral dissertation, because in his dissertation, he worked with the early papyri using from James Royce, and he used instead of using scribal individual scribal singular readings, he used a exemplar or a base of a manuscript was copied. And this has never really been done before, to my knowledge anyway, that you had a exemplar or a basis for copies. And so what happened was he used four exemplars and looked at the copies. So it's like looking over the shoulder of the scribe and see if it made. So what they find, they were very meticulous. We're going to go into a particular family that was very uh, interesting. All right. So it's all over the Mediterranean region. So there's different types. There's 98 to 100%. So there's actually manuscripts with virtually identical. Right. Then you've got with odd text with unique errors, you've got 93 to 95%. And Alexandrian, you talk about accuracy was 92%. And there was Egypt. So the most accurate copied manuscripts were the Byzantine type texts. And that's based on empirical evidence with Alan Taylor Farnes, where he used papyri, and then he also used the later manuscripts. So, and I also mentioned about the issue of the Alexandrian. If you look at Oregon, he said, look, everyone was doing their own thing, basically. I'm paraphrasing. Yeah, so there's a lack of care because you had individual personal copyists where you had scriptoriums with the Byzantine manuscripts. They were very well copied to the point that some of them were virtually exactly the same. All right, so let's look at it. You've got Byzantine tradition, established by the Byzantine tradition, based on manuscripts, fathers, versions, and lectionaries. So, in terms of the printed Greek texts, I'm trying to be in competition with Wayne Green with a number of Greek testaments. You've got Family 35, right? That one, Wilbur Pickering, very, very interesting. It's got the best. If you read Greek, this has probably got the best critical apparatus. And the reason being, it looks at variance and it gives you percentages of usage, and also compares with all the major printed New Testament. So it talks about the Nestles of Land, Hodges of Falstaff, Robert of Pierpoint, the patriarchal text, text receptors, and the Computian polyglot. Right, so it looks at percentages, and so this is probably the easiest. If you learn Greek and you want to do a comparison of the testation to variant readings, this is the one. I have to agree. And I think Dwayne Green's mentioned here, I think he was involved in this one. So this is Wilbur Pickering's one. Brilliant critical apparatus. The next one is Hodges and Falstaff. Now, coming to this one. This is the first Greek New Testament based on the majority text. All right, so this is Hodges and Falstaff, both not alive today. That's Zane Hodges and Arthur Falstaff. So he was the first one. Now, where his claim to fame, I think Hodges or Falstaff, they were involved in the one of them was involved in the actual translation of the New King James Version. So that's a claim to fame for this one. And they put interlinear. But you've got the Greek text, the majority text, but it actually is based on New King James. So this is Zane Hodges, who's involved in the New King James Version. And this one, I must say, has a critical apparatus. So it shows you where the division between the Byzantine text type and it also goes into the division with the Egyptian type text of manuscripts, and also mentions the major manuscripts like Codex Vaticanus, Alexandrinus. Yeah, that was a hard one to get hold of when you live in England. Next one we have is Robertson Pierpoint. All right, Maurice Robertson Pierpoint. I think it'd be fair to say, arguably, this is probably the main Byzantine type majority text, and I would say Byzantine type. This is the main one, really. The only thing I would say, it doesn't really have a critical apparatus like Family 35 and Hodges and Foss. It's not as detailed, really. Okay. Right. And what do we have next? We have the patriarchal text. The next one is used by the Greek Orthodox Church. Right. This is the patriarchal text. So this one, it's just basically the Greek New Testament. The translation, the English translation for this, shows you the difference between the Alexandrian text. It's a bit like the New King James, with the variants shown at the bottom, where verses were missing, or these variants. Yeah. So this is the patriarchal text where you get the Orthodox Bible translated from. And then we have, I've got two here. I've got the Scrivener. I've got the normal Scrivener from Trinity and Bible Society. This is an analytic Greek text. Now, this one is produced by the Dean Burgin Society. And what it is, it gives you the underlying text behind the King James Version. And why this is different, it actually gives you the differences between the Westcott and Hort English Revised Version. So in the bottom terms of the Greek of the Westcott and Hort, so that's the annotated, Scrivener's annotated Greek New Testament. I really want to get this one in leather bound, but I didn't get it. And just to say, this one is interesting. I've got this. It is the Englishman's Greek New Testament. This is Stephen's of Greek text of Stephen's 1550. And this one's quite interesting because it shows the differences. It must have been over 100 years old. It doesn't have the date in here, but it's got the various readings, differences between Eliza, 1624, Riesbach, Lachman, Tischendorf, Tregelles, Alford, and Wordsworth. So it's an interlinear based on Stephen's Greek New Testament, 1550, as you can show, the right's too small. And very interesting. And this one's interesting, used by the critical text people generally, is the Stephen's 1550, where they use it to compare with certain critical text readings. So that one's a very interesting one. And it's the first text receptors which have a critical apparatus. And it went on to have, in the next edition, it had chapters and verses. So we have to thank Stephanus for that. Okay, so in terms of English translation, Wilbur Pickering done his own one called The Sovereign Creator Spoken, was particularly mainstream. Hodges and Falstaff, the NKJV is actually based on the Textus Receptus. So the reason why I put that there, he did produce an interlinear, all right, but really the Hodgson Farstad Byzantine, when it comes to mainstream Byzantine English translation, it's the King James, New King James. You've got Robson Pierpoint, you've got Adam Boyd, the text critical English New Testament, very good, very little translation. It's a little translation, but the good thing about that one is that it shows the difference between the translatable differences between the Greek New Testaments. Okay, and then we've got Eastern Orthodox Bible, very similar to the King James, uh, and it also, like the New King James, it shows the different variants at the bottom, and it gives you a bit of history about the Eastern Orthodox Church. Very, if you're interested in church history, Christian history, the Eastern Orthodox Bible is pretty good because it gives you some background in terms of their structure and their polity. That's very useful when looking to the text of criticism. Okay, and then you've got text receptors, which is the basis of the King James and New King James version. Right, let's go with Hodgson and Farth. It gives a little background here. They relied heavily on von Soden's classification of the vast network of Byzantine manuscripts. Now, what does that mean in English? Yeah. So basically, what happened, there was a man called von Soden who grouped all these a number of manuscripts into different families, um, and he identifies KX, so which was generally the Byzantine type text. And he also, but they use that was for the Gospels, Pauline epistles, and general epistles up to Jude. But for Revelation, he used a apparatus used by Hermann Hoskier. So from Matthew to Jude, he used von Soden's classification of Greek New Testaments. All right, KX, which was generally, or Koine, generally the Byzantine type text. But there is an issue with that. For the evidence of the majority text, the present edition relies heavily, just from the introduction, information furnished by Hermann von Soden. Though this has been extensively checked with the 8th edition of Constantine Tischendorf, with the apparatus of SCE Leg for Matthew and Mark, and with the apparatus of United Bible Society 3 and Nestle's Line 26, only really can von Soden's data be corrected with confidence. So even though it relies heavily on that, it's had to cross-reference with other printed Greek New Testaments. Williamson Pierpoint, very similar. They use the same information. So Hodgson Farstad and Maurice Robinson's Greek New Testament. So these two are very, very similar, because they use the same information, which is known as KX. All right, it's a group of manuscripts identified von Soden. But so there is an issue. This was so Hodgson Foster was the first one in the early 80s. I think it was 82, and Robson Pierpoint was about a decade afterwards. So one of the issues is, although the present text parallels that for Hodgson Farstad, there are significant differences in the text since they were constructed on the basis of different principles. Textual distinctions from Hodgson are due either to their particular interpretation of identical data, their use or rejection of additional data, or because some of the items in the difficult to read von Soden apparatus were neglected or misinterpreted by them. But the reality is there's very little difference between these two. Very little difference because they use the same information. But I would add, this one has an apparatus, a critical apparatus. This one here has a critical apparatus, and this one doesn't really have one. Right, now one of the issues about the von Soden, using von Soden's information, there was a man called Hermann Hoskier. I think he was a banker by trade, and he was known for his books Codex B and its allies, and he was the one who looked at the difference between Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, found 3,036 differences just in the Gospels alone. He gave up trying to find other differences because he was a pretty good job. And so he said, I looked at great things from Dr. von Soden's final volume of the text. The early volumes were very heavy reading, but expected that his text and critical notes would fill out gaps in our studies. Alas, he has got complicated problems instead of writing usual work on great happen condemned strongly. As the presenter of the combined critical material to make every allowance for the division of work, 40 people, it can be said that the apparatus is possibly honeycombed with errors. And many documents which should have been recollated, have not been touched. Others only partially, others again have been incorrectly handled. So he wasn't a fan of von Soden's work. Frederick Wise, he did a book called the Claimant Profile Method. Um, if you can get your head around it, it's really good. Once the extent of error is seen, the word inaccuracy becomes a euphemism. Of the 99 checked manuscripts, 76 were missing one or more times when they should have been cited, or were listed when they should have not been. This breaks down into 59 manuscripts were missing in von Soder's apparatus, from 1 to 4 times, and 39 which were added correctly 1 to 6 times. Von Soden's inaccuracies cannot be tolerated for any purpose. His apparatus is useless reconstruction of the text of the manuscript he used. That's his book, Claimant Profile Method. Right. So basically, I would add they're fairly solid, even though that is said, they are fairly solid representation of the Byzantine text type. Maurice Robinson, he also in his preface, I think it was in this one, uh, and I'll just go to that in bold. But to be fair to these guys, they did cross-reference with other sources rather than Philon von Soden. So he said, although von Soden can't be relied on when dealing with specific readings of individual manuscripts, his overall general reliability in regard to the larger groups of text types and subtexts remains stable in the view of the evidence provided by those outside sources. So to be fair, they didn't just use von Soden, but they used other sources, but they are very similar. I'll just add to that. Okay. Wilbur Pickering, very interesting one. Among all those manuscripts, the largest group of independents, about 200, there are well-made copies of the original autographs. It's called the KR family. So basically, von Soden set a group called KX, and then there was a subgroup that was so meticulously. Now, if you see videos from Wilbur Pickering, he is correct in what he's saying. It was so meticulously copied that some of them are virtually identical. Very, very few errors. Excellent. And it's the one which I find the most interesting out of all of them. And this is what he says, yeah? Among all these majority text manuscripts, the largest group of independent transmitted has hundreds of manuscripts that are well-made copies of the original. No, uh, this is from the Claimant Profile Method. It's called the KR family or family 35 or simply F35. Now, the one it represents is called minuscule 35, so that's why it's called family 35. And it's the only large text within known New Testament Greek manuscripts. It's consistent in its archetypal form in all 27 books. The scribes who produce the core manuscripts that represent family 35 clearly believe they were copying scriptures. This is actually taken from Wilbur Pickering's website. So I want to faithfully represent what from the writers themselves. So they were very meticulous, excellent. And I would say is that its apparatus is the best, in my opinion, brilliant. I use it constantly to find out percentages of variance. I cannot recommend this one. Even if you're a Texas receptors kind of person, this is really valuable to have. Yeah. Um, right. This is what Frederick Wise said on KR. Right. Now, the R stands for revision. Now, what they believed, it was so meticulous, they believed it was a revision. So it was actually ordered by the church. Now, one of the things that Wilbur Pickering actually said is that one of the mistakes that people make about the Byzantine texts is not like the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had one pope, he could give an order, and hence you got the Vulgate. With the patriarchal system of the Orthodox Church, they were fairly independent. So St. Catherine's Monastery is independent from Mount Athos, and even on Mount Athos, you've got different monastic orders on there, affiliated to different patriarchs. So Mount Athos, even though it's in Greek, it's affiliated to the Constantinople patriarch, right? But even on the island, right, of Mount Athos, you've got different monasteries affiliated with different patriarchs. So it's difficult to have one person say, right, we're going to have one standardized text. So that was the argument. But here's what he said, Frederick Wise said on KR. This large group consists of more than 200 manuscripts were discovered by von Soden. The group is a result of an early 12th century attempt to create a unified New Testament text. The copying was carefully controlled and the accuracy is unequaled in the history of the transmission of the New Testament. KR slowly gained popularity and became the most copied Greek Testament of the late Middle Ages. Now, it's what Frederick Weiss has said, somebody independent saying that, but I would disagree with him point that to have a unified Greek New Testament, that didn't really happen till probably when I got to the patriarchal texts. Yeah. So patriarchal text. We'll grab that one there. Now this one, this is basically the one for the Greek Orthodox Church. And the unusual thing about this, it's not based on Greek manuscripts, it's based on lectionaries. Now, lectionaries are like the hymn books. They've got readings for particular days, particular readings for Easter, particular readings for their traditional holidays, etc. So 116 documents were used in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, this is why I would disagree with KR being a revision, because if that was the case, the patriarchal text would be based on family KR, family 35, rather than lectionaries. So if it was standardized, this would be the standard document for the Greek Church, Greek Orthodox Church. So it's 116 documents of Eastern Orthodox Church, 45 from Mount Athos and Constantinople, with the rest come from Athens and Jerusalem. The source texts used date from 9th to 16th century. The majority come from the 10th to 14th century. The patriarchal edition of Byzantine text is 1904 was the first one, later revised in 1907, and then 1912, Professor Vassilios Antoniades, publishing, and it's published in 2020 by the Hellenic Bible Society. And it includes the Kumayoan. Now, what you find is that with the patriarchal text, they go by church tradition. For example, it's been used constantly in the church. They will adopt that. So you'll find Acts 8:35 and 1 John 5, 7, and 8 in here, and you'll find Mark 16:9 to 20. So it's very similar to the TR. There's differences, but very similar in terms of controversial readings, what people class as controversial readings. So it's very similar there. Now, they're missing me not to talk about text receptors, so I'll just give a quick overview. I've already done a video on the text receptors. So you have Erasmus, these various editions, Stephanus, very influential, and Beza, which was used as the basis for the King James, Eliza, and then you've got Scrivener. Now, Scrivener's Greek New Testament is where he tried to identify the Greek um, text behind the King James. So what you found was, even though Beza was the main one used, but there's sometimes you'll find Stephanus, he used a Complutensian polyglot. So he just worked from printed Greek editions, yeah? So with Scrivener, he worked from printed Greek editions, where these gentlemen here, Erasmus, Stephanus, Theodore, Beza, Eliza, they work from Greek New Testament. Now they're very similar, and I hope you've learned something. I certainly did. All right then. God bless you. God keep you, and may He cause His face to shine upon you.